Invincible Season 4 Episode 5 just came out, and let me just say, it was jam-packed full of epic action, amazing reunions, and also some major character changes. So with that being said, today we're talking Invincible Season 4 Episode 5 breakdown and review. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Alright, Invincible Season 4 Episode 5, let's get right into it, because pretty much right off the bat, we get the reunion between Omni-Man and Invincible. Now, this is a moment we actually got to see in a couple teasers leading up to the episode, and it definitely lived up to expectations. It was so enjoyable to see Mark and Nolan reunite once again, because although us as an audience has been following along with Nolan as he does go through his redemption arc, the last time Mark saw Nolan was all the way back on Thraxa, so he doesn't know a lot that has happened to his father. In fact, he quite literally thought his dad had been executed by this point. Conquest even said that to him, and now Omni-Man returns, asking him to officially join in this war. And something that I really enjoyed about this moment was that there wasn't much pushback from Mark, because the entire Viltrumite War has been something that Mark has been aware of from essentially the very beginning. Alan has mentioned it to him multiple times, and Mark has stated to Alan multiple times that when it is time for the actual fight, he will be there. So I really like that they didn't even toy with the idea that Mark wouldn't trust his father or that Mark wouldn't join in this battle. This was just simply a moment between father and son trying to rekindle their bond. And I also like that Nolan mentioned wanting to see Debbie. However, Mark very rightfully so pointed out that this may not be for Debbie's sake. Although Nolan says he wants to apologize, Mark points out that this may just be something that Nolan wants to do for himself. And this is actually something Mark also says later on with regards to Oliver. However, that being said, Nolan still decides he is going to go see Debbie. However, right when he is about to ring the doorbell, he changes his mind. And this was a choice that the character made that I actually really liked, because if he wasn't changed at all, he would have, without a doubt, either opened the door right away, or he would have at the very least knocked on the door, rang the doorbell, and had her come and see him. However, this is a changed Nolan, and he started to acknowledge and realize that Mark probably was right, and that he was only going to see Debbie for his own selfish reasons. Even if he was trying to truly apologize to her, which I do genuinely believe he wanted to do, it was more so about himself and making himself feel better because of how bad he felt for what he did to her versus him genuinely wanting to do it for her. She probably would have been better off if she had never seen him again. And in this moment, him deciding to put her feelings above his own, someone that he once considered a mere pet, shows so much character growth and personifies why Omni-Man is one of the best characters in this entire series. However, before Omni-Man can leave, the door opens, Debbie looks at him and just walks away. However, she left the door open. And it's at this point that we get one of, if not my favorite interactions in the entire series. The reunion between Debbie and Omni-Man. And at first, Debbie doesn't say anything. Omni-Man just goes on and on with his apology. And as soon as he is officially done talking, she snaps back at him. She asks if he still considers her a pet. She mentions how he isn't a good person, how that 20 years didn't do anything, that he did unspeakable things not only to the people of Earth, but to her, and more importantly, to their son. And it's at this point that Debbie decides to start punching Nolan over and over again, to the point where she probably broke her hand and it even started bleeding. This moment was so impactful for both of these characters. And another thought just crossed my mind: what would have happened if Paul was upstairs and Omni-Man just happened to see him walk down the stairs? Would he have flown over and killed Paul? I don't know. I personally don't think so. However, even though this is a changed Nolan, he isn't changed that much. So would he be able to contain his emotions? I'm not sure. However, that is probably why they decided not to even do that. They did not include Paul until very much so later on. However, before Nolan is officially done apologizing to people, he decides to go and see Art. And in this moment, we get some interactions between Art and Nolan that are absolutely amazing. I raved about Art in the last episode. However, I think these moments in this particular episode between Nolan and Art are actually even better than the moments we got between Art and Mark. Specifically, the moment where Nolan mentions about Art making him a new suit, and Art has that line where he says, "I only make suits for heroes." And then you just see the disappointment and sadness on Omni-Man's face, and then he does decide to leave, and it's at this point we see how much of a facade Art was putting on. He immediately gasps for air, and in those moments you can tell Art was genuinely afraid, and he definitely has good reason to have that fear. His last interactions with Omni-Man were quite literally shortly after he had murdered the entire Guardians of the Globe, and he was keeping up a lie that he did not do it. He was lying to Art, lying to Debbie, and the last time Art had seen Nolan was quite literally the time he had to lie straight to Nolan's face as Debbie was investigating him. That had to be so incredibly nerve-wracking. However, he still pulled it off, and this moment goes to show why Art is genuinely one of the best characters in the show as well. So anytime we get any type of moments with him, especially between him and Nolan or him and Mark, I'm going to absolutely love it. And speaking of Paul from a bit earlier, we do get some Paul in this episode. We actually see him part of the breakfast montage before Oliver and Mark have to leave for space. They have a nice family breakfast between Debbie, Mark, Oliver, Paul, and Eve, and this was a really nice moment. We've seen multiple times they all have breakfast together, so before they go off to this Viltrumite war, them having a nice family moment together was really touching. However, speaking of touching, I also really enjoyed the interactions between Eve and Mark before he does have to go away. Them just simply laying in bed together, and Eve talking to Mark about how everything has changed and how she genuinely cannot lose him, and just saying to him that he better not die. This is by far and away in my top 3 fictional couples of all time. Mark and Eve are so perfect together. I absolutely love every single moment that they have together on screen. I genuinely did think that Eve was going to tell Mark before he left for this war that she was pregnant. However, you can see from her perspective that telling him this major news right before he is going to go into what is the craziest and most dangerous conflict he's ever been a part of could be pretty risky. So she decides she's going to table that and deal with everything on her own until he gets back. This is definitely very admirable for Eve. However, I don't know the ramifications that this is going to have later on down the season. I feel like depending on how long he is gone, this could have some major developments down the line. And as someone who has not read the comics past the point we are at right now, because I do not want spoilers, I do not know if this is going to have major ramifications. I do not know what is going to come of this. However, I do definitely have a feeling that something is going to happen from this. I feel like it's something that is way too big to not have any long-lasting ramifications, at least in the immediate aftermath of Mark returning to Earth. However, speaking of not reading the comics, I feel like a lot of diehard comic fans are probably going to not be too happy with something they did in this episode, and it has been rumored since essentially the start of season 4 of Invincible, and that is regarding Tech Jacket. A lot of people were saying that Tech Jacket was rumored to be gender swapped. In the comics, this character is Zach. In this episode, you could tell right away, as soon as someone said to Tech Jacket that you are the man, you knew instantly the line that was going to follow, and lo and behold, the helmet comes off. It is a woman, and she quite literally states that. And we get some dialogue that does tell us that this is not Zach, it is Zoe. And I know a lot of the internet is going to be pretty outraged about this, so I do have a couple of things to say about it. However, before I get to all of that, I will say the scenes that Zoe was a part of were pretty enjoyable. The interactions between her and Alan were really funny. The interactions with her dad were actually really awesome. I love how supportive her dad is of all of the hero stuff, and I love that he immediately was just like, okay, I'm gonna pack you some lunches and I'll make sure you're good to go on this space voyage. That was awesome. This is probably a top 5 dads in the Invincible universe, so I genuinely love that moment. I also like when Zoe first has to see Omni-Man and jokes about if he's going to kill her or not. That was really cool. As far as combat goes, I feel like Tech Jacket reminds me a lot of Blue Beetle, just in how her suit functions. It reminds me a lot of the Scarab, especially because it is sentient, and we did get to see her square off against a couple of Viltrumites, and she was still able to go toe-to-toe with them. So all that being said, now let's get into something everyone is going to be talking about and a lot of people are going to be outraged about. Them gender swapping Tech Jacket. Now, do I personally have a problem with this? No, but for two reasons. And those two reasons are I did not read the comics before going into this series. So I don't have any preferences on the characters. The show is what I'm introduced to first. And then I read the comics up until the point we're at in the show, just to compare how the comics were compared to what we got in the series. And realistically, I don't believe up until the point of Conquest, Zack was a major part of anything aside from the Invincible War in the comics. So that is another reason why I genuinely don't think I had any type of issue with this. However, there is something that I do have an issue with. And I also definitely can see why a lot of people are going to have issues with this. And it definitely does go into gender swapping. However, it goes even deeper than that. Just in a broad sense, I feel like when this topic gets talked about, it is often asked, why can't you do this? Why can't you gender swap? Why can't you change the character? However, to me, that question is actually the issue. You see, the answer to that question is actually quite simple. Why can't you do that? Because you're not being true to the comics, because you're not honoring the source material. So instead of that being the question should be, why did you change the character? And if you can honestly give an answer as to why you changed the character, maybe there was a reason from a story perspective as to why you decided to make this critical change. If you do that, then I am genuinely okay with it, because then there is a genuine reason to change this iconic character. So that is why I really am not a fan of anytime people say, well, why can't you change them? What's the big deal? The big deal to me is that that question is so flawed. The reason not to change them will always be to honor the comics and to be as true as possible to the character that you are putting on screen. However, that being said, if your story is slightly different, if you are trying to make the story even better than it was by making this change, then that is a justification for changing the character in that way. So if down the line we find out they had a genuine good reason for making this character change and it would help to serve the story better, then I believe most people should be receptive to this. However, if they decide to eventually never explain why this change happened, especially from a story perspective, and give us any type of story beat that needs this change to have happened in order to be an actual story beat, then it becomes a huge problem. And that's a huge problem that a lot of comic book fans are going to have. You see, us as fans want things to be as close to the source material as possible. However, we also appreciate nuance. So if changes happen for the betterment of the story and have an actual purpose, most of the time, a lot of fans will be receptive. However, if that change is made for no reason other than just to do it, then a lot of fans are going to have a ton of issues. So that's all I have to say on the matter. Do I personally care about the gender swapping? No. However, what I do care about is that a lot of times the conversation is always why not change the character versus why to change the character. You should always focus on why the change is necessary versus trying to force other people to justify not changing the character. The justification will always be to honor the source material. So if you're making this change, you have to do it for an actual good reason that will benefit the story in the long run. That rant aside, because then we go into space, and once we go into space, we have Invincible versus Conquest Part 2. And I know a lot of people thought this was going to end on a cliffhanger. However, they gave us the entire battle. We saw Conquest along with two other Viltrumites taking on Alan, Tech Jacket, Oliver, Omni-Man, and Invincible. And not only did we get some rematches, we actually got an interaction between Omni-Man and Conquest, which was absolutely awesome. I feel like anytime Omni-Man interacts with people from Viltrum, it is something that is really cool. He was someone who was crazy respected in the Viltrum Empire. So him interacting with anyone after his betrayal is really cool. Him telling Conquest to stay away from his sons, and then Mark just going absolutely crazy on Conquest was awesome. One of the things that I found pretty interesting about this, Tech Jacket and Alan do get separated from the other three, so they are just stowing away on the Viltrum ship thanks to Tech Jacket's suit. One thing I was slightly disappointed in was Alan going against some of these Viltrumites. These to me were not top tier Viltrumites aside Aside from Conquest, I know Lucan did survive the battle with Nolan. However, I don't think he is top 5 or even top 10 amongst Viltrumites. So the fact that Alan wasn't putting in more work against these enemies was pretty disappointing to me. After his little altercation with Anissa, I thought he would be way more capable of going against Viltrumites, and not only just Viltrumites, but high-ranking Viltrumites. So this is something that I am going to be very interested to see down the line, if they do keep this up with Alan, or if he does start to level up to match the strength of high-ranking Viltrumites. But speaking of high-ranking Viltrumites, we then go to the battle between Invincible and Conquest, and this battle all happens because Oliver needed some air. Omni-Man actually recognizes this and tells his son that he needs to go to that planet down there and get some air, and as he is doing this, Conquest is hot on his tail, and right as he is about to put the beat down on Oliver, Invincible swoops in, tackles Conquest, and they begin their epic fight. If you can even call it a fight, because for the majority of it, Invincible is just holding onto Conquest's neck and telling him that he will not allow Conquest to breathe. And we see Conquest quite literally flying Invincible through multiple things. We see him punching him repeatedly. One time he quite literally punches straight through Invincible's midsection and is pulling out his intestines. This moment was incredibly visceral, and you can see the pain on Mark's face. However, even despite this, he tightens up his grip, and Conquest's face changes colors even more. You can see the life literally leaving his body at that point as he slowly pulls Mark's intestines out more and more. However, he can't do this in time, and he does inevitably die. And it ends with Invincible laying there with a giant hole in his stomach, intestines right next to him, and Omni-Man and Oliver looking on with horror. This was one of the most brutal scenes that I've ever seen, not only in Invincible, but in all of animation. I genuinely have no idea how Invincible is going to come back from this. Yes, he's been wounded before in some pretty serious ways. However, Conquest quite literally was pulling out all of his insides for almost an entire minute. This is absolutely crazy. However, I feel like after Mark does inevitably heal from this and comes back from this, he is going to be even stronger. As we know, every time Viltrumites do get close to death and they do end up healing, they gain strength from that, and they gain a lot more durability. So I feel like this is going to result in us seeing a much stronger version of Invincible, and considering that they will be going up against Thrag, this is going to be something that he desperately needs. However, that is all I have on this episode. This was genuinely one of my favorite episodes, not of just this season, of the entire series. I loved all the emotional moments, all the interactions. The only negative that I do have about this episode is that we didn't get a reunion between Cecil and Omni-Man. That is something that I desperately wanted. However, I feel like someday in the future they will have to interact again. I feel like not having those characters interact once more would be a huge miss, and I don't see the creators doing that. So that is something that we'll have to look forward to in the future. But I'm interested to hear from all of you. What did you think of the episode? Did you have an issue with them gender swapping Tech Jacket, or are you totally fine with the change? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.